My name is Bethany Bernier, and I'm a fourth-year honors student doing a BA in psychology. So I took the humanities course as an elective because my plan is to do political science with a focus of Indigenous peoples in Canada, specifically policy work. So the reason why I took Indigenous humanities is because I didn't have an academic background, whereas I have a cultural background because I come from Flat Bay. So I wanted to do more academic work with Indigenous academics. So the course itself, we look specifically at autobiographies and biographies of Indigenous peoples, and by doing that course, it really it was almost interdisciplinary for academic work and just personal stories, which I enjoyed because I think that's important when looking at Indigenous work, because our way of learning Indigenous culture is through discussion and teachings and conversations and passing down the knowledge through oral history. So since we did look at autobiographies, biographies, and scholarly articles, it allowed for the traditional way of learning essentially through the books itself. The course consisted of students at Memorial doing it for course credit, also community members, and then there was participants who were taking the course itself for an Indigenous certificate that you can do at Memorial. I think the aim of the course itself was to bring different perspectives through the course offerings of who could take the course. So I come from an academic background by doing it for my degree, whereas a community member who has taken it just for community enrichment, they're bringing a different perspective as they look at the community, like the Mi'kmaq community, or what if they're a part of any Indigenous group, they bring that perspective, more of a grounded perspective. And then you have mature students who bring the perspective of a different generation. So I think the course, it was interdisciplinary in that way, and perspectives itself to bring different perspectives to just show that Indigenous studies can be at a academic level but also at a community level, and that can be merged. And I also think that an aim of the course was to teach people of two-eyed seeing, so looking at situations in a through a westernized lens, but also through an Indigenous lens, and creating that merge, because I personally think that's the best way to look at Indigenous studies in an academic lens, because you are getting those two perspectives. And the reality of it is that we live in a world that we have to look at everything through the two lenses, because we are immersed into a westernized culture, but we still hold that Indigenous, we have to ground ourselves with the Indigenous lens. I think that this course really does justice to Indigenous academia, because it doesn't say that the Indigenous way is the better way to study, but rather we did stress the idea of two-eyed seeing, and I think that's essential because, like I said, the reality of it is we live in two cultures, and we participate in two cultures, and there was never, the Indigenous way is the best way, but rather the way we look at things is important, and that was stressed in the course. It also stressed how we can look at academia not only in a westernized view, and that autobiographies and biographies give real-life examples of things that we study every day in different courses. And by including the first-hand perspectives of different situations, it connects the students with the idea itself, rather than just telling history through history books. And I think that's important because you see the actual struggles of people. Coming from a psychology perspective and looking at residential schools, it really shows where modern day issues that Indigenous peoples faced with their mental health, where that resonates from, and because you can't understand the issues that Indigenous peoples face today with their mental health without knowing where it came from and what they experience. So by looking at these autobiographies and biographies, it allows for that, and you can look back and like find where these problems come from. So like I said, coming from a psychology perspective, we're always taught to look at the books itself and look at everything scientifically and empirical evidence and whatnot. By taking this course, it proves that that's not the best way, and it's not always the best way. You do need to have the scientific evidence is important, but you also need to have the personal experiences and perspectives on it, because we all have different. We might have the same experience, but we have different perspectives on it. And by looking at this course and looking at different autobiographies and biographies that speak on experiences that people have, they all have different perceptions on the experience itself. We can look at individual differences. And by me taking this course, it allowed me to apply Indigenous studies into my psychology degree. For example, for my seminar course, we spoke on narratives, and we focused on the psychology aspect of how important narratives are. But through taking this course, I was able to look at how important oral narratives are when teaching Indigenous history, and it allowed me for the application of interdisciplinary studies, and it really allowed me to look at concepts in a different way, where I would just look at it scientifically. I think when looking at Indigenous education, I originally looked at it as if, okay, well, it's just taking a westernized lens and applying it to studying Indigenous peoples, but that's obviously not the case. Coming from Flat Bay, I realized that a lot of people kind of want to study Indigenous people, but simply going into an Indigenous community and saying, well, look, I want to do research on you, that's not the case. You can't do that. So I think Indigenous education is teaching the history of Indigenous peoples. It's teaching their perspectives, because they have a completely different worldview on the different situations. I think it's recognizing and respecting that their way of educating isn't the same as what we have. They do it through oral narratives. They do it through experience. You don't just sit down with someone and say, hey, can you tell me everything about that you know about residential schools? It comes up through conversation. So we need to recognize and respect that the way that Indigenous peoples educate their people are completely different than the way that the westernized view is, and how we would be educated on Indigenous peoples in the university itself. So I think it's a merge, and I think that two-eyed seeing should definitely be, that's essentially what we're doing. We're looking at Indigenous peoples, Indigenous culture, Indigenous ways of life through the Western lens, through research and whatnot, but we also have the respect of the traditional way of how Indigenous peoples would do it. And I think it's two-eyed seeing, and I think that's the best way to understand Indigenous education. So I think indigenizing universities and academia and whatnot, there's a lot of different levels you have to look at it. So at a smaller level, you need to gain respect within the classroom. So that needs to occur, because there is so many students, even at my university, that identify as Indigenous. So there needs to be respect for their perspectives. There needs to be inclusion and accessibility in the classroom itself. So the professor needs to recognize that those views are in the classroom. You have those students that bring the different perspective. It needs to be valued, and it needs to be enhanced rather than tokenized. So you don't, if you bring up a topic in class and the professors say do want to have a different perspective, they can't say, hey, so-and-so, can you give us your Indigenous perspective on it? It needs to be kind of just generally brought up in the conversation. It needs to be respected rather than tokenized. There are so many Indigenous academics in Canada now, and including their work into the course definitely it should occur. For example, it shouldn't just be scholarly articles that are about Indigenous peoples. It can be an Indigenous academia who studies math, and you can just implement their work into the course itself, because you're indigenizing it without tokenizing it. At a smaller scale for the campus itself, there needs to be representation of Indigenous students when they're not there. For example, you can implement artwork on the walls to show that there are Indigenous peoples at this campus. We recognize them and we appreciate them. Therefore, we want to represent them when they're not here in the physical space. You want to have staff, faculty, professors who are aware of Canada's history, so they need to have a good way to understand what has happened on the land that we live on. They need to be consciously aware of it, and they should respect that. Therefore, when they have students in their class that come from an Indigenous background, they are better able to have conversations with them and to recognize and respect where they come from. You also need to have events that Indigenous students or faculty and staff can participate in, so that they feel welcome. A lot of people have to leave their hometowns that may be, like, for example, Flat Bay is a traditional Mi'kmaq community, therefore we have powwows, we have a band office, we have elders in the community. So many students are leaving that, and you still need to have that cultural connectedness to have a good holistic view and to have maximum performance, because most students are used to that when they come here. They're used to having their culture surrounding them, so they need to have opportunities such as that when they come here so that they can perform to their maximum ability. I think we need to have more Indigenous Affairs officers at the school. So for example, at my school we only have one, and she's very stretched. So I think implementing more Indigenous Affairs officers would be the best approach, because then more services can be offered, and I think that would be the best approach. And then in that case, then the Indigenous Affairs officer can aid in the education of staff, faculty, and professors.